Once Upon a Time in Hollywood by Quentin Tarantino, a book that I never would have read if it wasn't for you guys out there. Yeah, you guys not only requested this, I put a poll up and you voted for me to read and review it. So here I am. And I bumped into this book literally at a Barnes & Noble. It was sticking out on a table, and I wondered, what the hell was this thing? It said, Once Upon a Time in Hollywood by Quentin Tarantino. Is this a retrospective? Is it a script? What the hell is this thing? It's a novel. I was absolutely surprised by it. I still didn't pick it up, mainly because I was just okay with the movie. I thought it was fine. It wasn't one of his best works. But here we are. I read it. I'm about to review it, clearly. But before we get into the review itself, if you have not seen the film or read the book, what is the hook? What is Once Upon a Time in Hollywood about? Hollywood, 1969. Rick Dalton, once superstar, sees the twilight of his career on the horizon. Along with his friend and stunt double Cliff Booth, they navigate the changing landscape of entertainment. Before we get into character, I should probably say that this book really feels like a long-form outline. It feels like Tarantino is figuring out the characters. He's figuring out the plot, which is very, very thin, but he's just brain dumping. He's brainstorming. These are character sketches, etc., etc. And when I looked a little bit deeper, I found out that he took about 5 years to write this novel and decided toward the end that, hey, maybe this should be a film, which is kind of a weird thing to say considering he's a screenwriter and not a novelist, but here we are. And so he turned it into the film that you know or don't know. And the novel was released in 2021, I believe. But the irony here is it doesn't feel like a novel. Feels like I said, a long form outline, a lot of extraneous stuff that you probably don't need, that I think an editor probably should have removed or tightened up. But again, this is its own beast. It's probably like nothing you've ever read before, and maybe that's the point. And the fact that it is written in this odd way is both a strength and a weakness. But let's talk about character first, and we'll start with Rick Dalton. He is a man who had a successful career on a show called Bounty Law, a Western. And now he is struggling to find work. He's becoming irrelevant in Hollywood, which often happens, of course. And he gets a gig on an upcoming Western playing the villain. And this is when the subtext begins. And I think that is what's so great about Tarantino's characterization, is that he really digs deep. He really thinks them through. The great thing about Rick Dalton in the book versus the film, he's far more fleshed out. I know that goes without saying because a novel generally has more time to do this, so we get deeper characterization, but I still think they could have accomplished the same thing in the film. So a man who is used to playing a hero, now playing a villain, like I said, subtext, and the best part of his journey through this book is meeting Trudy, a young 8-year-old actor, not actress, and she says that herself. They're on set. He is her kidnapper, and she's reading a book about Walt Disney, and he sits down and asks, hey, do you mind if I read my book alongside you? And she said, as long as you don't bother me. And she asks what his book is about. Of course, it is about a cowboy who got injured and his life is not the same. More subtext. And even early on in the book, Rick Dalton himself says, you never rent in Hollywood, you buy in Hollywood because you're never going to leave. More subtext. So I think you can see what Tarantino is doing here. Rick is our flawed protagonist. He has a lesson to learn or something to accept. And I felt like it was done beautifully here. The tragedy of the film versus the book, though, is that I never really felt that Rick's arc came to a close in the film. In the book, it has such a beautiful scene at the very end. It's a conversation between him and Trudy, and it completed the picture. It was such a great ending. I was getting very frustrated with this book a lot of times because of the exposition. It's just so tedious. I'll talk about it when I talk about the writing. But the ending made me so happy. It was a nice conclusion to, like I said, what was extremely tedious at times. Let's talk about Cliff Booth next. My favorite character. He's a caricature in a lot of ways. He's a war hero, unapologetic murderer, stuntman, handsome badass. Tarantino really threw everything in the kitchen sink. You may say, this sounds like a generic hero. Well, he kind of is, but what Tarantino does, and again, this is absent from the film, is that Cliff is a cinephile. He's an absolute movie junkie, but not any kind of film. Art house stuff from Europe, independent work. And it was such a great, ironic other side to Cliff. Because on one hand, he's this murdering, morally gray badass, but then he also has a taste for art, for the finest things film has to offer. And so it was really nice seeing that side, seeing that he was fleshed out so much more in the book, because in the film, he's really just the other half. Oh, to top it all off, I forgot, he even tried to become a pimp at one point. So yeah, Cliff's by far my favorite character. I love the chapters with Cliff. Even the ones that were completely exposition. Even though I was being told the story at that time and not shown the story, his antics were so insane that it was incredibly entertaining to read. The rest of the characters, while they're on the page, are pretty well realized, but obviously, Rick, Cliff, they are the stars of the book and where most of the time is spent. There's even a weird side plot with Charles Manson, and you get so much more in the book about that, about how he was a up-and-coming musician. Well, I shouldn't say. He was a wannabe musician. He had a music career, or was trying to have a music career. That I don't think is touched on at all in the film. But his inclusion feels like it was just put there to be put there, just like the plot. And I think it's time to talk about that because, man, this is where things are all over the place. It feels just like a collection of events that are thrown together that have no rhyme or reason, no forward momentum whatsoever, except for the thread that is Rick Dalton, and his arc comes to a conclusion, as I mentioned, with Trudy at the end of this book. The film, not so much. I mean, I guess you could argue that the scene where he's invited in by Sharon Tate is somewhat of a conclusion, but it doesn't have the power that the novel's version did. Funny thing about that, I read that Tarantino shot that as written. Both he and Leonardo DiCaprio were in tears, and they felt like, I guess, tonally it just didn't fit right, and so they omitted it. So it does exist somewhere on a cutting room floor, which sucks because I really, really love the way the book ended. So apart from the seemingly random events that comprise the plot, there's a lot of movie trivia, there's a lot of anecdotes, there's a lot of exposition. Well, I guess that's including exposition, but it's so much of it. I would say, if I had to guess, if you took out all of the exposition in this book, you'd probably remove half of the text. There is that much. Full chapters, massive parts of chapters, the most tedious part of this entire experience, kind of interweaving with the plot, what plot there is, kind of not. It felt like Tarantino was going off on these tangents because he was interested himself. Again, I have to stress that this book over and over and over again feels just like a love letter to Hollywood. It's Tarantino creating his own characters and injecting them into an alternate history, 1969 Hollywood. And that's totally fine. I just feel like if he would have created a more cohesive plot, and I'm all for experimental stuff, I just needed a little bit more in the film, a little bit more in the book, probably an editor to really slice out some of that very tedious exposition. I forgot to mention Brandy, the pit bull. So there's such a great story about how Cliff comes to own her, and it's a beautiful man and dog story, and it's completely omitted from the film, which is kind of weird because I feel like that pivotal, very violent, very visceral, very disgusting but entertaining scene at the very end of the movie would have made so much more sense if we knew the history of Brandy. But I know, you only have so much time in a film to tell the story, and it's already pushing 2.5 hours. So let's talk about the writing itself, or as I like to call it, the cinematography of the novel. I feel like I've covered a lot of this already. So this, again, mixed bag. I was really wondering what it would be like to have Tarantino, a screenwriter by trade, write prose. I thought it was going to be sharp. I thought it was going to be punchy. It is at times. He has some brilliant writing in this book. Sometimes, the key word being sometimes. There's a great scene that is not in the film that is about Charles Manson sending one of his followers to go into a house, presumably to kill somebody. I really love the execution in that scene because it's this woman sneaking into this house, and Charles Manson's voice, right? She's hearing his voice in the back of her mind or in her ear, whispering in her ear. And I remember being on the edge of my seat. I think Tarantino created a very visual, visceral experience with that moment. But a lot of this book, so much of this book is just him flexing his movie trivia knowledge, him creating character sketches. He's figuring out who Cliff Booth is. He's figuring out who Rick Dalton is, and he didn't take it out of the novel. So it's incredibly frustrating to come from a brilliantly written, immediate scene where you can just see everything unfolding before your eyes to a big, massive info dump, especially ones that aren't about anything that interests me personally. And I know that's hard to find, obviously, because not everybody is going to be interested in the film history of that time period. It's almost as if like Tarantino wrote this book for himself and nobody else. And I know authors write books for themselves, but to me, this felt a little too excessive. There's also the anecdotes, as I mentioned. There is one anecdote I really enjoyed, and that was about Roman Polanski and his adaptation of Rosemary's Baby, because I really enjoy that film. And he talked about how he turned it into art. He turned the novel into pure art. So that was another one I wasn't bored with. However, so much of this novel I was bored with, which is why I'm going to give Once Upon a Time in Hollywood by Quentin Tarantino a 6 out of 10. A novel that really is just a love letter to Hollywood more than it is an actual story, with signature Tarantino characterization that is the only thing that truly grabs your attention, the only thing holding this thing together, with a plot that is barely one at all, and writing that is part what you'd hoped and part what you dreaded. But it really illuminated the caricature and the reality of Hollywood, what it turns people into, and the delusion they believe. So overall, I would say I enjoyed it, but there's so much about it I didn't like. That's why I gave it a slightly above average score. But still, thank you guys so much out there for requesting it. It is always great to pick up a book that I would not have picked up myself, to see what you out there might have saw in it or didn't see. So let me know, did you read Once Upon a Time in Hollywood by Quentin Tarantino? Do you disagree with me? I would love to hear it down in the comments below. And if you'd like to check out my own writing, my own novels, check out the link down in the description. And thanks for watching. Thanks for hanging out with me. And I'll see you in the next one.